A few years ago, I set out on a quest to find the worst cartoon ever made. The reason why I decided to do such a thing was because I noticed that there was a lot of discourse surrounding what people considered the worst movies ever made and the worst video games ever made, but nobody ever did the same thing for cartoons. And the stuff that people were calling the worst cartoon ever made were very questionable to say the least. Stuff like Teen Titans Go and Dark Age SpongeBob and whatever. Stuff that's not good, don't get me wrong, but like, come on, they're not worst cartoon ever made levels of bad. No. I knew that there had to be stuff out there that was far worse than Teen Titans Go and Dark Age SpongeBob. And it's with this that I decided to take on a very long, very painful journey to find the worst cartoon ever made. Along the way, I would find tons of perfect candidates for the worst cartoon ever made. Some more controversial than others. Several cartoons that I think are the nadir, the absolute lowest point for animation as an art form. Stuff that makes me think, oh damn, animation can really be this f***ing bad, huh? Who would have thought? And it just keeps on going. It seemingly never ends at all. Just when I had thought I found the worst cartoon ever made, I find a cartoon that's somehow even worse. And so today, here we are with a milestone episode. 30 episodes of the search for the worst cartoon. And I figured what better way to celebrate 30 episodes of the search for the worst cartoon than by going back to where it all began and re-reviewing the very first cartoon that I looked at on this series, Alan Gregory, a short-lived Fox cartoon from 2011 that only lasted 7 episodes. And so in April of 2020, I uploaded the first ever episode of the search for the worst cartoon. I wanted to make more episodes after, but given how 2020 was a very rough year for obvious reasons, I just didn't go forward with it. Over time, I just lost interest in the series, and I didn't feel like continuing it at all. For years, I just left that one Alan Gregory video as just a one-time thing and that's it, never to receive a follow-up of any kind. That all changed in early 2023 thanks to a certain cartoon that received widespread ridicule all around the internet. I am, of course, talking about the one, the only Velma. The massive backlash that Velma received when it first came out made me interested again in this idea of trying to find the worst cartoon ever made, especially knowing that there were several terrible cartoons that had come out since the Alan Gregory episode, with Velma being one of them. I already had tons of different ideas for cartoons that I could cover on the search for the worst cartoon, Velma being one of them now. Slowly but surely, I would go through each of these cartoons, finally giving them the search for the worst cartoon videos that they deserved. Around that same time in early 2023, I discovered a very strange, very obscure cartoon that I saw no other cartoon YouTuber acknowledge. I was originally going to have it be a completely normal, random video, nothing related to the search for the worst cartoon, and then I decided, nah, you know what, let's make this the search for the worst cartoon comeback episode, why the hell not? And the cartoon that I went with to bring back the search for the worst cartoon was this. Let me just go ahead and clear something up. If anyone claims that in the latter half of 2023 I tried to start a massive lost media search for a crappy web cartoon based on a crappy sitcom made by a weirdo obsessed with feet, no, I didn't. I would never do such a thing. Never, I'm telling you. Anyways, going back on topic, throughout the beginning of 2024, I had been planning to revisit 2 cartoons that I had previously looked at on this series, because I didn't like how the original episodes for them turned out. Our Cartoon President and Alan Gregory. I didn't like how the original episodes covering these 2 shows turned out, and I thought that they were in dire need of a remake. I also thought that it would make sense to have the 30th episode of the Search for the Worst Cartoon be dedicated to me revisiting the first cartoon that I ever looked at on the series to celebrate the milestone. And so, alas, here we are again, back to where it all began. Alan Gregory. The initial consensus that I had for Alan Gregory was that it was not a good show, obviously, but it wasn't the worst thing that I had ever seen. And even after all this time, it still remained one of the better cartoons that I covered on this series. It still remained on the top 10 of the Search for the Worst Cartoon ranking list. But eventually, there had to come a point in time where I realized this wasn't fair. Sometimes opinions can change. What I initially believed in 2020, I might not believe it in 2024. It wasn't fair to have a cartoon that I binge watched all the way back in early 2020 sandwiched alongside a bunch of shows that I had binge watched throughout 2023. Shows that were still fresh inside of my memory compared to Alan Gregory, which was on the verge of being forgotten about. There had to come a point in time where I would rewatch the show with fresh eyes to see what I think of it now in 2024 compared to what I initially thought of it back in 2020. After giving our cartoon president a proper chance and thinking, oh wow, this is much worse than I initially made it out to be, I was ready for the same thing to happen to Alan Gregory. I was ready to rewatch this show and think, holy crap, this is so much worse than I initially made it out to be back in 2020. I was ready to rewatch this show and think, how was this still in the top 10 of the Search for the Worst Cartoon ranking list? This is garbage. This is awful. I was ready for that. I really was. And, well, as it turns out, my thoughts on the show haven't really changed all that much. Alan Gregory is still not a good show at all. It is far from a good show, but it is also far from the worst thing that I have looked at on this series. If anything, out of every cartoon that I've looked at on the Search for the Worst Cartoon, I think Alan Gregory is the one that has the most potential to be a good show. This also makes it one of the more frustrating cartoons that I've covered on this series, because I really want this show to be good. I see a good cartoon in this. I really, truly do. I don't really get to say that a lot for the cartoons that I look at on this series, but with this, I do think that this could have been a good show. There are a lot of things that could have made it a good show. I want it to be a good show, but it just isn't. The premise of this show has potential. The show follows Alan Gregory de Longpre, a pretentious, spoiled, rich kid who lives with his equally pretentious father, Richard de Longpre, Jeremy, Richard's romantic partner, and Julie, Alan's adopted sister. For most of his life, Alan Gregory was homeschooled by Jeremy. However, as a result of the 2008 recession affecting his family, Jeremy has to try and find a job to help support the family, meaning that he is unable to homeschool Alan. This also means that for the first time in his life, Alan Gregory has to attend regular grade school. Again, this premise has the potential to be funny. There are ideas here that could work. The contrast between this spoiled, privileged, rich kid going to a normal grade school, that could be funny. In the first episode, there's a scene at the school cafeteria where it's like everyone else is eating normal cafeteria food, and then you have Alan over here eating sushi and drinking alcohol. And it's not funny, but like it has the potential to be funny because it shows you the contrast between Alan Gregory and all of the other kids at the school. But even though the show has a lot of potential to be funny, it just isn't. Why is that the case? Well, allow me to explain. Seeing how Alan Gregory is meant to be this spoiled, privileged, rich kid, that naturally means he's not going to be the most likable character you can think of. I've seen people criticize this show for being mean-spirited, and while I don't disagree with that necessarily, I feel like people don't understand that that's kind of the point of the show in a way. The premise of this show would not work as as well if Alan Gregory was a lovable character that was nice and kind to everyone around him. Alan Gregory is supposed to be a pretentious, unlikable character. The problem is, I think they made him a little too pretentious and unlikable, to the point where it's not very entertaining to watch him. Alan Gregory as a character is supposed to be annoying to the other characters around him, but funny to us, the audience, and instead he's annoying to both the other characters around him and us, the audience. As it turns out though, Alan is not the only unlikable character in the show, as you also have his father, Richard de Longpre. Fortunately though, these are the only two really unlikable characters on the show. In contrast to Alan and Richard, Jeremy and Julie are a lot more normal. They're a lot more likable in comparison, and so naturally that ends up making them the butt of a lot of jokes on this show, especially Jeremy. Again, the problem with these two characters is not necessarily that they're unlikable. The problem is that they are too unlikable, to the point where it's not funny to watch them. It is possible to make a show that has unlikable main characters, but still have it be funny despite that. Unfortunately, Alan Gregory misses the mark by, again, making Alan and Richard too unlikable. If there's one thing I will say about Richard specifically though, it's that whoever voiced him on this show clearly had fun voicing him. Whoever voiced Richard was probably the only person to have fun working on this entire show. There's clearly a lot of energy and dedication put into voicing this character, and it just makes me wish even more that Richard was a funny character. Richard has all of the ingredients that could potentially make him a funny character, except for the main one, the humor. And that's a shame if you ask me. On the topic of voice acting, the titular Alan Gregory is voiced by none other than Jonah Hill. Yes, Jonah Hill. I should have brought this up much earlier into the video, but Alan Gregory does have a very big name attached to it. As a matter of fact, not only does Jonah Hill voice the title character, but he's also one of the 3 creators of this show as well. In contrast to Richard, it feels very off hearing Jonah Hill's voice coming out of this character. Maybe that was intentional, maybe that's part of the joke, that you wouldn't expect this character to sound like Jonah Hill, I don't know. With that said though, I do want to go over the other big problem with this show. As a matter of fact, I think this is the biggest problem with this show. I would be willing to let the unlikable nature of Alan Gregory and Richard slide, considering the fact that, again, the show wouldn't work if these characters were likable. Again, there's still that potential for these characters to be funny, even if they are unlikable characters. With this, though, there is no potential for it to be good. There is no way for it to be good at all. The only way that this could possibly be good is if it wasn't in the show at all. In the first episode, Alan gets in trouble for drinking alcohol at school, and as a result of that, he is sent to the principal's office, where we meet Principal Gottlieb, in which Alan Gregory immediately falls in love with her, despite the fact that she is an elderly woman. Now, this is something that I'm supposed to consider funny. The audience is meant to watch this and think it's funny, but it's not funny at all. The first time Alan meets Principal Gottlieb, there's a really disturbing fucked up dream sequence that, like, I don't even know if I can go into any detail about it. I sure as hell am not gonna show you a single frame of it, that's for sure. It's just so uncomfortable and unfunny. The good thing about this, though, is that of the 7 episodes of the show, this subplot is only featured in 3 of them. The first episode, the second episode, and the 7th and final episode. It's briefly brought up in the 3rd episode, which focuses on a school dance, but it's not really the main focus of the episode, and it is not brought up at all in episodes 4 to 6, so, you know, that's a plus, I guess. Again, it would be be much better if this whole subplot of Alan Gregory being in love with the principal was not in the show at all, but it's not really in the show that much, so, I mean, I guess that's something, I don't know. If there's one thing I will say about Alan Gregory, though, it's that it went through like a breeze. I don't know if it's because this show is only 7 episodes long, or if it's because I've already seen this show before, but this was an unusually quick cartoon to get through. I started watching the first episode of the show, and then before I knew it, I finished watching the 7th and final episode, just like that. Now, I have sat through a lot of short-lived cartoons on this series, but none of them felt as quick to get through as Alan Gregory did. This thing, for whatever reason, was just a breeze to get through. I was able to sit through all 7 episodes like they were nothing, which is something that I cannot say for the other short-lived cartoons that I've looked at on this series. Hoops, for example, is only 3 episodes longer than Alan Gregory, and yet it felt much longer to sit through in comparison. Has-Been Hotel is only 2 episodes longer than Alan Gregory, at least at the time of making this video it is, but it felt much longer for me to get through in comparison. So you know what, I'll give this show a little bit of credit for that. It was weirdly quick to get through. Again, maybe it's just because I've seen this show already. Even if it's been years since I watched it, still, I have seen it before, but I don't even know if that's the case. This show felt unusually quick to get through, so you know what, I can't really complain that much. It ended before it ever really began, and considering how unnecessarily long the episodes of Our Cartoon President were, considering the absolute slog it was to get through that show, I'm not complaining at all that Alan Gregory was something quick to get through in comparison. Something else that I will acknowledge about this show is that, for bad adult cartoon standards, Alan Gregory is at least original and unique. I understand that this show came out in 2011, long before Family Guy clones became a thing, but still, this felt different from the other bad adult cartoons that I looked at. Not only because this has the potential to be a really good show, but also because, like, I don't know, it just kind of feels like its own thing. For better or worse, there aren't really that many other adult cartoons that are like Alan Gregory, but that kind of makes the show even worse in a way, because then it's like, this has the potential to be a really good show. It has a premise that could potentially be really funny, and it doesn't feel derivative of Family Guy or whatever, like a lot of other bad adult cartoons do. This actually feels like its own thing. And that makes the fact that this show is bad, that makes it even worse. I already brought this up in the Hoops episode, but I figure I might as well bring it up here again. Watching all of these terrible, short-lived one-season cartoons has given me some weird fascination with them. Just the idea that, like, these were shows that could have had that potential to grow and become the next big thing, but they didn't. They never became the next big thing. They were all canceled and subsequently fell into obscurity. In the Hoops episode, I brought up how looking at these one-season cartoons just makes me think, what if? What if they got a season 2? And I especially felt that with Alan Gregory. As soon as I finished that final episode, I just sat down thinking, that's it? I just sat through it, I guess. I sat through every episode of this show. There is no more of this show after this episode. It just ceases to exist after that. It just makes me think, like, what would a hypothetical season 2 be like for this show? Let's say in an alternate universe, despite the show receiving poor reviews, it gets renewed for a season 2. Would that season 2 be better than season 1? Would it actually improve on season 1's flaws? Or would it just be the same thing as season 1? Would it retain the same flaws? I just can't help but think, you know, what if? What if it got a season 2? But then at the same time, as I brought up in the Hoops episode, sometimes these short-lived one-season cartoons, they just I don't see them becoming, big cartoons or anything like that. And that might apply to Alan Gregory as well. Ignoring the fact that Alan Gregory is bad, I don't know if this show would have a long run or anything like that. I don't know if this show would go on to become a staple for Fox cartoons, one of their big signature shows. This show aired in 2011, in the same year as Bob's Burgers. Somewhere out there, there's an alternate universe where Alan Gregory is this massively successful, long-running show for Fox, while Bob's Burgers is just this short-lived thing that gets cancelled after one season and subsequently falls into obscurity. And I am genuinely curious as to what that universe looks like. Ignoring the fact that the show is bad, I have to wonder, would it have any sort of longevity? Would it have any sort of legacy to it? Ignoring the legacy it has now of being one of the most infamous bad cartoons ever, what legacy would Alan Gregory have in this alternate universe where it's a good show? So as I mentioned before, Alan Gregory ran for only 7 episodes, and so naturally I would watch all 7 episodes for this review. When I first looked at the show back in 2020, I remembered there was one episode that stood out. There was one episode of this show that I thought, hey, this was actually pretty good when compared to the rest of the show. That being the 6th and penultimate episode of the show. So as mentioned before, Alan has 2 fathers, Richard and Jeremy, and this episode focuses on him trying to find his biological mother. He finds a woman in a diner that he believes is his mother, and so he sets up a date between Richard and the woman. Throughout the show, Richard is explicitly gay for Jeremy, and so throughout the episode, with this woman, Richard tries to convince himself that he is a straight man, which leads Jeremy into feeling a lot more isolated in the family than before. This is further showcased in a montage where the family go to a carnival and Jeremy is just left out of most of the activities that the rest of the family do. Eventually, this causes Jeremy to leave Richard and move to an apartment, which then leaves Richard in a depressive state. As the episode progresses, the mother gets more fed up with the spoiled, pretentious nature of Alan Gregory, while Alan Gregory gets more fed up with his mother for trying to make him into a more likable kid. It's honestly the only time in the show where the spoiled, privileged nature of Alan Gregory is actually pretty funny. By the end of the episode, the woman leaves the DeLongpre family believing that they are terrible people. As it turns out, at the end of the episode, there's a strong chance that this woman actually isn't Alan Gregory's mother, and that the file Alan received that led to him finding the woman was just a random file that was found first thing, leaving the mystery of Alan Gregory's real mother forever unsolved. I've brought up numerous times that this show has the potential to be good. This show could actually work. It could still be funny even with the unlikable nature of its main character, and this episode I think is the closest to showing that. This episode shows that it's possible to retain the unlikable nature of Alan Gregory and still have him be a funny character. Back when I first watched the show in 2020, I thought that this was the standout episode of the show. This was the best of the 7 episodes. And to my surprise, that's still the case rewatching this show 4 years later. I can only imagine what a season 2 for this show would be like if we ever got one. I can only imagine that alternate universe where this show became a mainstay for Fox, a big show for them. Whatever the case may be, Alan Gregory will forever be a failure. A short-lived 7-episode long failure that just came and went like it was nothing. It could have been the next big thing for Fox. It had that potential, but unfortunately, it just didn't live up to that potential. It's a shame considering the fact that, again, this show does have a unique feel to it when compared to other bad adult adult cartoons. And when you look at a lot of other Fox cartoons, maybe it could have added something new to them as well. With the exception of Futurama, almost every Fox cartoon follows the dysfunctional family formula that started with The Simpsons. And yeah, Alan Gregory follows that formula as well, but it could have done so in a different way. Having the dysfunctional family in question consists of two normal people and two rich, privileged people who don't have a grasp on reality. I must wonder now what Jonah Hill himself even thinks of this show over 10 years later, because I don't even know if he's ever brought the show up at all in retrospect. I don't know if he ever acknowledged the failure of this show and what he thinks of it now. Does he regret making the show? Does he think it could have been better? Does he think that the critics were wrong and that he made a work of art? I don't know. For all we know, he probably doesn't even remember the damn show. Well, I wouldn't necessarily find what Jonah Hill thinks of the show now in retrospect, but I would find other stuff that I think is just as, if not more interesting than that. I came across a few interviews that Jonah Hill held from before the show came out, and I decided to watch them for a multitude of reasons. Mainly because I wanted to laugh at how poorly aged these interviews were, seeing how the show would end up flopping hard. But what I wasn't expecting from these interviews was actual, honest-to-God, lost media from Alan Gregory. I managed to find an old interview with Jonah Hill from Comic-Con 2011, and throughout the interview, there are several scenes of the show that are spliced in, except, as you can clearly see, there is a noticeable difference visually. Alan and Jeremy have very different looking designs when compared to the final show, and there are moments in these clips that are not present in any of the 7 episodes of the final show. Like, this shot doesn't appear at all in the final show. In none of the 7 episodes does anything close to it appears. As it turns out, there is apparently an early pilot for Alan Gregory that was made sometime in the late 2000s, I believe. I think it was somewhere between 2008 to 2010. I don't know. And now it's obvious what must be done. Y'all already know what to do. We need to find this pilot ASAP. There's a possibility that this pilot could end up being better than the final show, and that it could show you the potential that this show had to be good, but then there's also a chance that the pilot is just as unfunny as the final show. Either way, I don't care. We need this pilot to be found. I don't care at all. Forget Lil Sam and Cat. This is the new thing that we're into, baby. This is the new thing we're doing. Another interesting thing that I would find is an article, a text-only interview that Jonah Hill had. I'll link this in the description below for you to read. But there was one question in particular that interested me. The interviewer asked if Alan Gregory would become a more likable character as the show continued on, to which Jonah replies by saying that Alan Gregory is an unlikable character, but deep down he's also insecure about himself. He puts on this pretentious, unlikable personality, but deep down he's insecure and he wants to be respected by everyone else, which is something that is not present in any of the 7 episodes of this show. The show starts with Alan Gregory being an unlikable character, and it ends with Alan Gregory being an unlikable character. Maybe this progress could have been seen in a potential season 2, but the show got cancelled, so we're never gonna see that happen. And then I would find another interview that Jonah held from December 2nd, 2011, 2 days before the final episode of the show premiered. So as I mentioned before, the show ran for only 7 episodes, but apparently there were 6 more scripts that were ordered from Fox for the show. Virtually nothing is known about these scripts. It's unknown how far they got before the show ended up getting cancelled. So there you have it, potentially more lost media relating to Alan Gregory, just like that. And also throughout this interview, Jonah Hill keeps bringing up how the characters on this show are meant to be awful people. Jonah Hill and all the other people involved with creating the show thought it would be funny to make a show about awful people that stay awful people. appeal, rather than have a show where the main characters are awful people, but at the end they become a lot more likable, they do something good, which kind of contradicts the previous claim that Jonah made about how Alan Gregory is insecure and he wants to be respected by everyone and whatever, but like, I digress, who cares? He keeps referring to this show as being very punk rock, which is definitely an interesting way to refer to this show, I guess. He talks about how he was able to get a show with such an awful, unlikable main character onto TV, which only makes me wonder, is this show bad on purpose? Is this an intentionally bad show? It's obvious that Alan Gregory as a character was intentionally made to be unlikable, but did they make him this unlikable intentionally? I mean, I gotta hand it to them, that's pretty ambitious, I'm not gonna lie. Unfortunately for Jonah Hill, this meant that the show wouldn't have very much mass appeal, nor would it last very long, both of which ended up happening to the show. But now I have to wonder, was this show made bad on purpose? Is this show intentionally bad? No, that cannot be the case at all. Something like the Red Ape Family, I could see being intentionally bad, because like what is the Red Ape Family, honestly? The Red Ape Family is some cheap, low-effort internet cartoon made by one guy in his basement. This is a proper cartoon. This had an entire team behind it. This is competently made. It aired on national television alongside The Simpsons and Family Guy. To make a show this bad on purpose is just, I have no idea, honestly. I don't know if that makes it more ambitious or not, but it's definitely something. Oh yeah, you know how I said the show wouldn't have much mass appeal as a result of its main character intentionally being extremely unlikable? Yeah, well, as it turns out, it seems that this show had a very small fan base at the time. I would read old articles from when the show got cancelled in early 2012, and I would look through the comments and I would find people expressing disappointment that the show got cancelled. You guys remember a few years ago when there was that whole meme that like Rick and Morty is a show for smart people, you need to have a high IQ in order to understand Rick and Morty? Yeah, I think Alan Gregory might have been the precursor to that, because I would come across quite a few comments talking about how Alan Gregory was actually a smart show and only dim-witted people wouldn't understand it, only dim-witted people would not find it funny, etc. I would specifically come across people complaining about the fact that Alan Gregory got cancelled while Bob's Burgers got renewed for a season 2, which is really weird to look at in retrospect. Of course, there were also comments from people celebrating the fact that the show got cancelled, believing that nothing of value would be lost. But it did seem like there was an extremely small fan base for this show, and to be honest, I could kinda see this show getting a cult fan base if it weren't for how unlikable its main character is, and if it weren't for the principal subplot. And so now I'm just left wondering, what do I make of this show? Is this show actually kind of good? Is this a misunderstood masterpiece? Are the critics wrong? I don't know. I mean, I guess if the extremely unlikable nature of Alan Gregory was intentional, then like, you know, mission accomplished, I guess. This show technically succeeded in what it set out to do. And so even though I don't really like the show all that much, even though it doesn't really have much mass appeal, I can kind of respect what it tried to do. I keep talking about how this show has the potential to be good, but like, what if it never had that potential to begin with? What if the show had its own other potential and it fully lived up to that potential? To have a main character that's just extremely loathsome and unlikable. I have no idea. Again, this could probably be a lot easier if I could find something from Jonah Hill talking about what he thinks of the show now in retrospect, but I could find literally nothing at all, so there's a strong chance he doesn't remember the show at all. Either that, or he's ashamed of the show and he doesn't want to be reminded of its existence because he's embarrassed by it. It could go either way, really. There are funny moments in this show. They're rare, but they are there. And as I brought up in the Hoops Skips episode. If a bad adult cartoon is able to make me laugh only like 2 or 3 times in its entire run, that's enough to make me consider it better than a large amount of bad adult cartoons where I just sit there staying emotionless, not laughing once at all. Even after all this time, Alan Gregory is still one of the better cartoons that I've looked at. Maybe that's in part because of the potential that it has. I don't see The Prince being a good show at all. The Prince has zero potential to be a good show, but Alan Gregory has that potential to be good. So even though Alan Gregory is not a good show, it is far from the worst thing I've ever seen on this series. I still have it in the top 10 of the Search for the Worst Cartoon ranking list, but upon rewatch I decided to move it down slightly lower. It still remains in the top 10, but it's only 2 spots lower. It's still one of the higher ranked cartoons I've looked at on this series. At least I can give credit to the show for being a breeze to sit through. It ended almost immediately after it began, and I got through these 7 episodes like they were nothing. The original feel that this show has as well is another thing that adds to it. Again, I understand that this came out long before Family Guy clones became a prominent thing, but still, it feels nice to have a bad adult cartoon that feels like, something different, something that isn't trying to ape Family Guy style or anything like that, something that feels like its own thing. I wish it could have been executed better, but oh well, happens, I guess. Anyways, that's about it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see you all next time. Adios.